Hi, I'm Kathryn.
And I'm Theresa.
And we are the co-authors of the book, Pass the Baton, Empowering All Music Students.
Our goal is to share stories of educators who are passing the baton and empowering their music students. We want to help teachers create music lessons that transform students from passive consumers to vibrant creatives. Welcome back to the Pass the Baton podcast. We are here to talk about all things student empowerment in music education. Before we introduce today's guest, we want to remind you, please follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes.
In addition, if you like what you hear today, please consider leaving a rating or review. That's what helps podcasts like Pass the Baton grow. Mm-hmm. Well, what'd you think?
Another great interview.
Yeah.
I think I've said this before, but I really love it when someone can give us explicit steps in how they worked through a process. And then that really helps me think about, okay, here's how I can take that and tweak it for my classroom. Sometimes when ideas are big and abstract, I struggle with it, but Michelle did such a nice job of saying, first I did this, and then I scaffolded it this way. And then this is how we built up to the students being able to independently give their peers feedback.
Yeah, I felt like I got a glimpse of what it looks like, which is so practical and helpful to make it my own.
Yeah, absolutely. And this element of peer feedback, that really does help them, be able to do this without us.
Yeah. And I guess the critical piece of I'm going to analyze somebody else's work, but then also when I'm constructing my own, I can hear that critical voice myself, to make my own thing better from the beginning. That's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Welcome back. We are here today with another awesome guest. We are here with Michelle Rose. And what's so cool is that you are not a stranger to Pass the Baton. We actually were able to talk prior to the book coming out. And, you were one of the featured encore stories. So it's great to have another conversation a couple years later and be able to talk to you today. So thanks for joining us, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And it feels like ages ago because I was talking about virtual ensembles and that kind of thing before the pandemic. It was one of the few places that would have me, you all were one of the few people that would have me talk about that before the pandemic. So I'm happy to be back for sure.
Yeah. I remember thinking when we all switched to virtual, we're like, whoa, this was kind of interesting timing. But anyways, before we go too far that way, can you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and what you're up to these days.
Sure. So my name is Michelle Rose, and I teach middle and high school general music fully online. This is my fifth year teaching fully online. So as I stated, I was teaching online before the pandemic started. I also direct my school's after school virtual choir. I am also a student right now. I'm getting my PhD in music education at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And in my free time right now, I'm working on a lot of carpentry projects. So trying to nurture the parts of my identity outside of my music teacher identity, since I am both a full-time music teacher and a full-time music student right now. So that's a little bit of me in a nutshell.
That's awesome. Yes. And it's important to make sure we have those things, right, that we can be excited about and really enjoy. So awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and today I know we're going to talk a little bit about peer feedback, but before we do, what's your why with peer feedback? What got you interested in it?
So I think that peer feedback is just such a valuable part of learning. And when I am able to collaborate with other adults who are able to give me really important feedback on the work that I do, whether it's written work or whether it's a composition that I've worked on for something small or something like that. It's always been such a valuable experience, but I didn't really have that in school necessarily. And so whenever I had to do peer feedback, when I think back to especially high school, when I was thinking, and even undergrad, when thinking about group projects and feedback, it felt like a waste of time to me. And I always felt like what I got from the teacher was always better. But a teacher's perspective is just one perspective. And when you can have a lot of different perspectives and the feedback can be valuable, it can really empower students way beyond what I can do as a single person. So I wanted to make sure that my students were getting the opportunity to receive and give high quality feedback and not have an experience where I was just like, I don't want to get feedback from my peers because it's all been bad. And in reality, it wasn't that they were bad at giving feedback. It was just that feedback, I have learned over time, is a skill. And you can't just tell students, okay, go and give each other feedback, because lots of them will default to, well, it's good, or it's okay, or I kind of liked it. But, getting them to give valuable feedback that then students can implement and make changes and all of that, I think is just invaluable, not only in the sense of, allowing students to improve their work, but also in the sense that it also builds relationships that aren't just like, I can't believe the teacher is making us pair up together and we're just sitting and staring at each other in a breakout room, because that's what things can easily turn into if they're not done well.
Yeah. Feedback is such an important element. And I think that's something that we as teachers, especially music teachers, we work to be able to give our ensembles feedback, give our students feedback, but for them to be able to do that as well. That's really cool. All right. So talk to us about your process. How do you get students engaged in this peer feedback process?
Sure. So I kind of came up with this process it's taking me kind of several semesters to really develop this into something that's worked effectively, especially because I teach fully online. It adds another layer of like awkwardness, because we've all been in a breakout room in Zoom where like no one's talking and it's like, well, what do we do? So I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't putting my students in a situation where they were going to dread coming to class, or they were, not going to get very much out of it. So I've come up with a system to essentially teach my students first and practice how to give feedback before they even get into groups. Because the very first time I tried peer feedback many moons ago, I just was kind of like, okay, give them one piece of positive feedback and one piece of constructive feedback. And I realized that was not working super well. So first, so I kind of have 4 steps that I take my students through. And so we do this project in Band Lab where we write a song and using loops. And so first we build out the knowledge base. So we do a lot of song analysis. I ask students, what their favorite songs are, and if I can find clean versions and it's appropriate, then we will analyze all these different songs. So we talk a lot about song structure, and we talk a lot about the elements of each part of the song, like what makes a chorus, and what makes that different than the bridge, and how do these things function in the songs that we already know. So that way they have vocabulary built up, and then we revisit that throughout the semester, but also a lot of examples of songs that already exist. Then after we have this knowledge base, I do a lot of error detection, and I call it errors only. So it's a situation where there's definitely going to be an error of some sort. And so at first I will, if we're talking about like a song form, we'll go through a song form, and maybe there are only pre-choruses but no choruses. And then I'll give students, 2 possible answer choices with the phrasing of the feedback. So we use a lot of, I noticed that, whatever it may be. So in this instance, I noticed that all of your pre-choruses don't have a chorus after them. And then we also practice the phrasing of the constructive feedback. Consider adding a chorus after each pre-chorus, or consider removing the pre-choruses and replacing them with choruses. And so there are kind of different options there. But students are practicing the phrasing that I want them to use throughout. And so we go from, okay, we have 2 options to then 4 options to then a whole list of possible errors. And they kind of pick and choose, what they're seeing and what they're hearing and justifying it. And so errors only, that particular step really important, because then we move on to error detection, where there may or may not be errors, or there may or may not be things that they can hear that need to be fixed. And that's kind of closer to what they may be encountering in the situation with their peers, right? Because there's not necessarily always going to be something glaringly, quote unquote, wrong with their song. Because I think a lot of times when we do error detection, we are assuming that there is some sort of big error. But then we practice, okay, well, if you're not hearing anything that sounds like an error or that sounds like it needs to be fixed, what are some other things that we could say to people in those instances? And so I do a lot of sentence stem. And so talking about like, okay, when you are listening to something, maybe you tell someone, okay, we layered the intro in this way. Maybe you could, instead of, I noticed that you put the bass track or the bass loop first, maybe you could start out with a drum beat and see how that sounds. So not necessarily like this is wrong, but perhaps think about it in a different way. How would this sound? Because we talk a lot about how in songwriting, there's not really a lot of right or wrong. It's kind of just like, well, let's try different things and experiment. And so giving students kind of real life error detection, whether there's going to be an error or not, something glaringly obvious or not, really sets them up to be able to give peer feedback constructively. And then lastly, we do one more exercise that's like kind of like a mock idea of what students are actually going to do once they get into their peer feedback. And so we go through an actual example closely to what they will encounter and work through it together. They have sentence stems that they can pull from. And so they practice giving that feedback over and over again. And then I also give them feedback on their feedback. So that way we go through all of this process to then get to the point where all of my students are giving each other constructive feedback that is actually valuable and that they can actually use. It's not just like okay, I'm checking the box, my students are collaborating, but this process helps to give students the model for how to give good feedback, because it's a skill. Just like, probably when you were student teaching, the feedback that you were giving was probably not as effective as it is now, simply because at least for me, I've had so much more practice. I can better articulate how to give feedback to students. So that's kind of my overall process. And it sounds like it takes a long time, but honestly, like just spending 10 to 15 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, just working on these feedback skills has made such a huge difference for my students.
Yeah. I love that you're saying how much you're modeling it and how much you're giving them that background knowledge for them to be successful. Because I think, like you said, sometimes our default is just like, okay, go get with the partner and help each other. Or, we don't really give them the information that they need to have that experience be meaningful, but you're really going through that process with them. I think that's so important.
Yeah, it's the modeling and also like the scaffolding, right? Like knowing, let's start here with, some errors that are going to be right in your face, but so then they kind of gain some confidence and they gain, that understanding. So they're ready for the harder things. It's awesome.
Yeah. And I think it's just like so important that if we want our students to get to the point where we're thinking really critically about music, I think back to myself in high school when I was a section leader. Okay, I did not have the skills developed to be able to run a whole band rehearsal that I did, when I was a band director, simply because I hadn't had that much practice, and I hadn't had the scaffolding of going to college and learning rehearsal techniques and learning all of that. So I think it's just really important, and I think this is just something that like we don't think about as much. It's like the curse of knowledge. Like we already know how to think about this critically. So how do we go back and teach our students how to think about it critically? That's something that I've always been working through. Like, okay, how do I break this down further to make sure that all students are on board? Because we're not born with these critical listening skills,
Well, and I feel like a lot of times in ensembles, we don't give the students the opportunity to use those skills, because as the director, it's like, nope, I can make this happen quick. I can tell them what's wrong. I can tell them how to fix it, and then we can just move on. And we think that that's the most efficient way to do things, or the most effective. But, as you're saying, if we can help the students gain those skills, it's going to help in the long run.
Yeah, and even for ensemble work too, I do have a very limited amount of time. I see students twice a week for 30 minutes after school, so it's very, very short amount of time. But I still try to foster this kind of feedback skill and put some time into it where we're listening critically. I'm not just like, okay, this is wrong, but like asking students, like, what do you think about this? Or like, what do you think went well in this particular section? Or what is something that your section needs to improve on? It does take time, but I also think the payoff is really huge, because especially in an ensemble situation, when students are able to listen back and catch errors, that takes a lot off of you as a director. And also, it's just like when you bring in a clinician who says the same things that you've said over and over, and suddenly your students listen. It's like sometimes it needs to come from someone other than the director. And so if the students are saying it, like, oh, noticing it, I find that somehow magically things get fixed a lot quicker.
And you mentioned, you're teaching online, but I feel like everything you said also works in person.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, honestly, this is like one of those things that you could easily do in face-to-face brick and mortar situation. Just instead of a breakout room, you just put kids in specific corners or specific places in a room. But this definitely translates really easily. And also, even though I mentioned it is a little bit more awkward to be online, I mean, peer feedback in general can be awkward for kids, especially if they don't know. There can be a lot of resistance, or if you have kids who are kind of really perceptive and they're paired with someone who is hesitant to give feedback, then those students can end up being frustrated. I also had a lot of peer collaboration actually between my two blocks. So we're on block scheduling. And so I had a student that was really excelling in first block and a student that was really excelling in second block. And both of them wanted like better feedback on they wanted to be challenged a little bit more. They were asking me like, what can I do better? What can I do differently? And instead of me trying to jump in and say, hey, this is like what I think I should do, I said, well, here's what I'm going to do. Send me your MP3 file of your song. I'm going to send it to, I'll email it to, so-and-so, and they'll work on it in independent work time. They'll take a listen and give you feedback. And both of my students said that that was one of the most valuable parts of the class for them, because they were both kind of on that same level and they got a different perspective than what I could give them. So it was a really cool moment, and another way, again, for differentiation too. Like you could always, instead of just like saying, okay, find a partner, you could be really intentional about, your pairings or groups of students and how you're going to give feedback. And I've paired students in all different ways, but especially for students who are really excelling in composition, for example, or are really perceptive, is a great opportunity to give students like an extra opportunity for feedback, because that was not an assigned thing that, I did with my first and second block students that were really excelling. I just said, hey, I'm noticing this. Let's try this. And that's what I told them in the very, very beginning of the semester. I said, sometimes we're going to try things and they'll work out great. And sometimes it's going to be a huge fail. And I said, let's try this. I've never really done this like cross collaboration between blocks, between students, because it's, I don't see any of my students in person and they're not in the same Zoom room. So it becomes a little bit more difficult sometimes, but just allowing them, to email back and forth and be able to give each other feedback, that was a really valuable experience and really exciting for me as a teacher to see these two students communicating at a high level and also taking that feedback and implementing it and being excited about getting feedback instead of just like, this is just a chore of school, which again, I felt like so frequently when I was in high school.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a benefit to those two students in particular. But I also was thinking, if I was a learner in your classroom, I'm thinking more critically so I can give feedback to other people, which also probably makes me think more critically about my own work before I pass it off to other people, because there's a stronger purpose. I know somebody else is going to look at it. Like, what are the benefits you see in your classroom since implementing peer feedback?
I have noticed that my students give feedback on things that I didn't catch or that I didn't think of. And so I've gone back, I've said this a couple times already, but I think just having a different perspective from the teacher and moving away from this, like, teacher is the knower of knowledge and the giver of knowledge, I've been trying to really get away from that as much as possible and empowering students to be exploring learning on their own and to be working with each other. It's just really beneficial for them to be more empowered, and definitely, thinking more critically about their own work, because, like you said, there is this kind of positive peer pressure of, okay, this is going to be going to someone and this is going out somewhere, other than just, I'm not just submitting this to Canvas for a grade, but I am going to be working with another student. And yeah, it's been really great. I think it's also really great too for students because they get to hear something totally different. Like, I never have any students compose something that's the same, because they get to choose the genre that they want to use, and then the loops that they use. It all turns out totally different. I had a Latin pop song, I had a heavy metal, hardcore, like really intense song, and so like totally different genres, but all of them kind of listening and giving each other feedback, especially on things that maybe genres of music that they don't normally listen to. A great way to also help students appreciate each other's work, because all of them know, like, I have them do reflections pretty frequently, and a lot of them talk about, like, there is a process to this. It's not just like I throw loops randomly into BandLab and it sounds good. Like, in order for it to sound like a cohesive song, I've got to really think about this, and I've got to really put some planning in. And people don't just sit down and write songs like in the movies where it's like, oh yes, I am going to sit down with my guitar and write a song and it'll be done in 2 minutes. It's a miracle, I think it gives students an appreciation for what their peers do and other genres of music and that kind of thing too. And it cuts down on my grading, to be honest, because, like, I like to give feedback. I don't really like to give grades just to give grades. I really don't like to give grades at all. But when you go in that direction, it's very time consuming to give quality feedback. And I don't always have time every single week to give my students high quality feedback on what they're doing. So just saving myself time, so I'm not spending hours and hours giving feedback to students, is again a way to prevent burnout, because you just can't, with the time constraints, you just can't give feedback every single week on a song project for students, even though in an ideal world that is what I would do. It's just not possible. So my students help me out in that sense too.
That's great. But you're helping them gain the skills to be musicians without you needing to be right there. They can be musical, outside of the classroom or without you having to hold their hand through that process. And that's so valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing that my students do actually is that they look at the BandLab tutorials. There's, like, I don't know how familiar you all are with BandLab, but I love BandLab for many, many reasons. One, that it's free, but two, that it's also high quality.
Yes.
3, there's a BandLab blog. And so there are tutorials. And so I have my students pick one of the tutorials. And so for their final project, they have to go through the tutorial, and I will come in and help them as needed. They know to, use the raise your hand button when they get stuck. But that way, I have given them the basic skills of, okay, how do I go about writing a song? How do I use this tool, BandLab? Okay, how do I learn a new skill in BandLab that I didn't learn from Mrs. Rose? But how can I look that up and learn it on my own? So that way they can go on and create music without me, because that's my ultimate goal, is that they continue being music makers beyond my class. Yeah. And BandLab is a great tool too, because it's free also outside of the school version. And so since I have high schoolers, I can encourage them to be like, hey, check out bandlab.com, because many of them are, eventually going to graduate and will be of the age. I know it's a little tricky when you're teaching elementary schoolers. You can't just be like, go to this website and create an account, but with high schoolers, it's like, hey, you're not going to be in my class at some point, but here's a tool. When you get out of high school, you can go back to it and make music for free on your own, and you already know how to use it. And if you want to make it in a new style or learn a new skill in BandLab, like, here's how to do that. So, and like you said earlier, the critical thinking that goes along with, okay, if I were listening to this, what kind of feedback would I give on this, definitely plays into that as well.
That's really cool. So if someone listening was interested in starting to incorporate more peer feedback, how would you recommend they get started? What could they start with tomorrow? Or
yeah, I think so. First, don't try to do everything all at once. Like, don't just be like, we're gonna have a peer feedback day. I think just taking small bite-sized parts of this, and also not feeling super overwhelmed by the process that I described, because I know it's there's these 4 steps and all that. But just understanding okay, we're gonna practice maybe whatever you're doing, whether it's an ensemble or a general music class, finding an example or creating your own example. So I create a lot of short snippets in BandLab, and I say, okay, this is someone's chorus. Here it is. And starting small and just taking 5 minutes and giving students 2 choices. What did you hear that was not quite right? And starting with that bite size, less than 5 minutes. And then slowly moving up, to more options, eventually giving students just a box of okay, this is all the possible feedback that you might be able to give, or you can think of your own. And so doing a lot of scaffolded examples first before you get to, okay, I'm going to put you into groups and we're going to listen to each other's composition. I would say, if you take anything from this podcast today, don't just put students into groups and expect magic to happen. There has to be some sort of step before that. And if you've done that before, that's totally fine, because that's how I started out, because I'd never really experienced a scaffolded peer feedback situation. I kind of had to discover it on my own when I realized, okay, this is just not working, especially when you teach high schoolers first thing in the morning, if it's not scaffolded correctly, it will just be crickets. It's kind of the opposite of elementary. When I taught elementary, I knew something was going wrong if it was just mass chaos. Whereas I know something's going wrong in high school first block if it's just nothing is happening. So, so just don't throw students into groups and expect good feedback to happen. Gotta teach them first. The only takeaway that I hope people will come away with this, because it's just, I go back to, I tell my students all the time, a lot of the things I do, I think about a lot, because when I was in high school, this is the thing that I really hated. I really hated busy work. I really hated group work, even though I work in groups as an adult all the time. I'm collaborating with you all, and this is such a valuable experience, and I've loved doing this, and I really loved being part of the Pass the Baton book. I have it on my bookshelf and everything. And that's group work, right? That's group work that I enjoyed. And so I think about that a lot. It's not that I prefer only working on my own all the time and I'm super independent I thought I was in high school. I just didn't know how to, in my group work, we all didn't know how to work together. And so I just think it's so important that we when we expect students to have these skills, even at the high school level, doesn't mean that they're developed fully, and that we might need to really teach them, okay, this is how we work in a group. This is how we give feedback. This is how, we're going to think about these things, because so many assumptions come into play with high school, assuming that kids just know. And a lot of times, some of them might, but not all the time. So at any level, and even at the college level too, like I often, like, especially in undergrad and sometimes even in grad school, there's some feedback that I get that I'm like, this is not helpful. Like, this is not helping me grow. You telling me that this is fine, like I think it's just such an important skill, but not one that comes built into kids, and not one that comes just with practice. Like we have to scaffold in order to get to a point where this is going to be meaningful for all of us.
Right. Yeah. And that's the key. It's making it meaningful, making it purposeful, have value. Then we can all grow from it.
Yeah. And I also wonder too, like, I think there's something that comes before it too, that I'm sure you do, is like the building community before you start to like say, hey, we're going to be vulnerable today and talk about our work, So how do you build community in your music room?
Yes. So I definitely have a lot built in from the very beginning. Before students even enter into my Zoom class, I start with a get to know you survey. So I know my students. We do a lot of like kind of fun but quick icebreakers. Like we have an attendance question that's like a this or that question. Lots of low stakes hot takes and like optical illusions, like which did you see first? Or like, is the dress blue and gold or black and whatever it was. Like, even though those are old, it's kind of fun to rehash them, and also just like modeling mistake making is really important. So I make mistakes all the dang time, and instead of just glossing over them or making a big deal about it, I just go, oh, I made a mistake. Like, I have spelling mistakes all the time. No matter how many times I read through my slides, I get to a point where I'm like, this is not a sentence that makes sense. So I'm going to change that. Or like, this is something that's wrong. Or, just like modeling mistake making in a way where it's like, oh, I noticed a mistake and I'm going to fix it. And no one's like, I'm not a failure because I made a mistake. And like, even when bigger things go wrong, like when I try things in class, occasionally it's just going to be a big old fail. Like the website is blocked and that derails my whole, like, I don't know what's blocked on student laptops. Sometimes I think, how can this possibly be blocked? Or like, Google is down, like some sort of Google Classroom is down or some. And so like, sometimes things are just a hot mess, and modeling that, like, okay, we're going to navigate this situation together and it's going to be fine. And we're just going to stay calm. I think is a really big part of that. It's how you are also, as the teacher, reacting to how these things are happening, because students are watching. And if you make a big deal out of something, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, this is a really big deal when I make a mistake. But if it's just like, okay, like here you are. And like, listen, I am married an accompanist. Like I married a piano player because my piano skills are not good. I will be 100% honest with you with that. And so like, but we just keep going. And like, that's it. And like, I give anonymous feedback surveys every single semester. No student has ever commented like, Mrs. Rose does not know what she's doing. She's totally incompetent. She cannot play piano. Or she like, I taught something completely wrong this semester. I can't even remember. And I didn't realize it till second block. And I was like, oh my gosh, I taught this wrong. Like no kid has ever come back and said, my teacher is a failure. They're incompetent. I can't believe I didn't learn anything. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, students do say like, oh, like Mrs. Rose is really honest and she's really kind and compassionate. And, when I make a mistake, like she's understanding. And so I think that's like a really big part of it, in a part of community building that teachers don't always consider, is that you also need to make a space that's safe enough for students to be able to say, there are going to be things wrong here, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, I always tell them, like, I'm learning along with you. And so we're all learning. No one is a master. There's no possible way to master every aspect of music. We're all going to learn from each other. And that's the really great part of this, is that everybody's bringing something different to the table. And so I think, you know, beyond just like the icebreakers and the community builders, really thinking about how you are presenting mistake making and how you are presenting perspectives in the classroom, and how you are presenting when students say, hey, I thought this was different, or I thought this was like, maybe that's not quite right, or I thought that this meant this. And I have students say that sometimes, and I always say, thank you for bringing that up, or thank you for letting me know that, or let's look into that. Tomorrow I'm going to get back to you. Just showing that, okay, there isn't like some person, whether it's a teacher or a peer, that's this like ultimate knowledge giver, that they're going to be the ones that we turn to and like they have all the knowledge, but rather like we all have something to bring to the table. We are all wrong about things sometimes, and we can all, you know, learn from each other and also have a conversation. And so I think that's really what's most important, especially when students are being so vulnerable, like you said, and sharing their work. I mean, I try to be as vulnerable as possible as a teacher, without being like panicked, right? Or without being like, this is the end of the world, because as even, you know, I've taught in brick and mortar and I taught online, and there are a lot more photos that I have to put out in the online environment simply because of the technology element. And so like, my students, it's so funny. Like I always was so surprised when some of them, I get the feedback that I'm very calm. And so like on the inside, I don't feel very calm. Like on the inside, I am panicking, but like you gotta kind of exude. Like a lot of times when things are going wrong, I'll just start like singing my thoughts and feelings, or, you know, just like being like, okay, well, this is happening and we're going to pivot, and we're going to pivot again until we get there. But just like when you have this environment where students feel calm and they feel ready to kind of like, okay, we're here, we're in music class. This is a space where like things are going to happen, but we're just going to keep going. I think that's like kind of the most important part of that process.
Yeah. They can't learn if they don't feel safe.
Yeah. And that goes beyond just putting up posters in your classroom, which I think is really important. Like, you know, you can put up a lot of things on your walls that maybe help students to feel seen or feel more inclusive, but none of that really matters if your actions and your words don't match whatever your posters say or whatever you're trying to communicate through your posters. So I think that's really important to be critical of, okay, what am I communicating to students? And like I said, those feedback surveys, I mean, they can, especially when I've given them to middle schoolers, they can be very honest, but I also learned so much from my own students, how to teach them better. And I tell them all the time, like, I ask them, what can I do to help you learn better? And sometimes it can be frustrating to me because it's like, okay, well, I did do this thing and apparently you missed it. You know, that's like always my first reaction. But then my second reaction is, okay, the student did not get this, or did not understand this, or did not feel the way that I intended. Like, what can I do differently? And so feedback surveys, super helpful, but they definitely require a lot of humility to take in sometimes. But yeah, it can really help you to assess, like, is what I want to put out into my classroom, is that actually coming through in my words and actions?
Yeah. And I think when the students see you take that feedback and then implement it, I think that means a lot.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's definitely another part of the feedback survey too, is that like I try after I get, so I give like a couple feedback, like small feedback surveys throughout the semester, but at the midterm and final time, I always give one bigger anonymous feedback survey. And then after the midterm one, I always say, okay, this is what I saw from the survey. Here's what I'm going to change, or here's what can't change. Like I often get a lot of like, this class is first thing in the morning and that's my least favorite thing. And I always tell them like, okay, totally fair. And like, that is above my pay grade.
Right.
So, but just acknowledging like, yeah, no, I get it. Like, this is very early. I understand. Like 8:30 is very early when you're like 17. And that's not something I can change, but I am acknowledging it. But seeing that like, okay, when I say something in this classroom, it's taken seriously and it's considered, and it's, you know, I'm not just like this, like, I don't know, child that's in a system that doesn't care, or that doesn't, like, I'm just going through this process to get out of it, you know, that there's an adult out there that like takes my voice seriously and is not just asking for feedback and then not doing anything. Because I don't know about you, but I've filled out plenty of surveys where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to put a lot of time and effort into my answers. And like, I know a lot of other people are probably thinking this too. And then it's like, they take this feedback and then nothing changes. It's like, why did I spend so much time like typing out, you know, all those thoughts? So just showing students that you take them seriously and that you respect them as young adults, but also that you hold them to high expectations because of that, I think is just another important part of, again, the feedback process. Like, I'm putting you into groups and this is not going to be graded. However, I do expect you to give good feedback and not just blow this off, you know? And like, I've never had an issue with that, but again, comes from classroom culture and setting this up. Like, we are here not to just fool around and, you know, just check boxes. We're here because we're making music that we like and that we enjoy and that we want to make the best that we can. And this is not just like I'm coming in here and just gonna goof off and not take this seriously. So again, going back to classroom culture, so much of it has to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been good. So many great things to think about, and so many things that are very actionable, which I always appreciate when we talk to podcast guests. So if somebody wanted to connect with you and learn more about your work, how could they do that?
The best place to find me on the internet is probably on Instagram. So you can find me at _musical_rose. So the musical rose with underscores where there should be spaces. You could also send me an email at michelle@themusicalrose.com. If you have like a direct question, I will get back to you probably within a week or two. My email response timeline is a little bit limited just due to the fact that I'm full-time teaching and full-time studenting at the same time, but I am so happy to talk with people and connect with people. That's like been the most valuable part of just being a teacher in the digital age, is being able to connect with so many different people all over. You can also, if you want to learn more about teaching online effectively, including if you're not doing it full time, that's totally fine. But you probably, if you're in a state like mine where we have inclement weather days that are virtual days. So if you want to learn more about how to teach online effectively and not have those days be a waste of time, I have a book called Teaching Music Online, a comprehensive guide for K-12 music educators. It's available through Flat Books, and there's something in there for everyone, whether you're a general music teacher, an ensemble director, elementary, middle, high school. So I'm hoping to update that sometime, probably after my dissertation is done. But even since I put it out, I'm just like, you know, things are always evolving, but it will give you a good base level of how to navigate that. And so those are kind of the two main things. And like I said, I'm so happy to connect with anyone. So if you have any questions, you want clarification, you want to learn more about BandLab, super happy to have a conversation with anyone if they would like.
Perfect. We'll make sure we put links to all those.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. This has been exciting, and for giving time over winter break too.
Yes, very much so.
So thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate the work that you all do in really highlighting some areas of music education that are not always at the forefront, but still super important. So I really loved, being part of Pass the Baton and the stories that you've highlighted and that kind of thing. So thank you all for your work.
Oh, of course. We are happy, and we're so glad that we get to continue these great conversations. Thanks for joining us. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
We'd also love for you to consider sharing this podcast with a friend and leaving a positive review. That's one of the best ways to get this message to new listeners.